The Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. Subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the legacy and the future of uranium mining and on H.R. 3405, Chairman Grijalva's Uranium Classification Act of 2019. Under Committee Rule 4F, any opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. First, I would like to say welcome to our witnesses and thank them for being here today. You know, stop me if you've heard this before, but a sector of the mining industry is in decline and the Trump administration has stepped in or is stepping in to try to bail it out. Turns out this is not just unique to coal. It's also the situation with uranium. Over the past 2 years, the Trump administration has bent over backwards to make the uranium industry's wish list come true. Just look at the steps they have taken. Shrinking Bears Ears National Monument, recommending lifting the withdrawal on new uranium claims around the Grand Canyon, possibly imposing a domestic quota for uranium in the next few weeks, and labeling uranium as a, quote, critical mineral, unquote. The arguments that we hear is that we need to secure, quotes, critical minerals for national security. But the Department of Defense, whose job is to ensure our national security, has not identified the uranium supply as a risk to our national security. The Department of Defense does classify climate change as an immediate risk to national security, but the administration is certainly in no hurry to address that. No, the administration is in a hurry to shrink national monuments and declare uranium a critical mineral. The fact is, a, quote, critical mineral is not the same as a, quote, important mineral. Even the president, who has a hard time with simple definitions, such as for the word fake, seems like he understands this. 2017, he signed an executive order that provided a definition of a critical mineral, and it's actually a pretty good definition. Under this executive order, a critical mineral must be, 1, a non-fuel mineral, 2, it must be of mineral material, and 3, it must be vulnerable to a supply chain disruption. Those are the 3 criteria. Uranium doesn't meet any of these requirements. Uranium is not a mineral material. That is defined in law as a common mineral like sand, gravel, or crushed stones. So doesn't meet that definition. Uranium certainly isn't a non-fuel mineral, since it's been defined in law as a fuel mineral since 1970. Yes, it is true we do import most of our uranium, but over half of our uranium supply comes from Australia and Canada. Let me be clear then. Uranium doesn't meet the definition of a critical mineral set by the executive order or by anyone else. Arbitrarily classifying uranium as a critical mineral and declaring it a matter of national security is just a way for the Trump administration to speed new mine permitting and prop up the declining uranium mining industry. We don't need to speed up new uranium mines. What we do need to do is to clean up the thousands of abandoned uranium mines that date back to the beginning of the Cold War. We haven't come close to cleaning up abandoned uranium mines or addressing the ongoing public health issues they cause. Most of these abandoned mines, over 500 of them, are on the Navajo Nation. These mines contaminate groundwater, crops, livestock, and homes, and have severe impacts on the health of the Navajo people. But we haven't cleaned up these abandoned uranium mines because we don't have a dedicated source of funding. The environment suffers, American taxpayers suffers, but most of all, the Navajo suffer just as they have for decades. Calling uranium a critical mineral is an excuse to bypass our environmental laws, and encouraging new mining won't solve these problems. They'll just make them worse. With that, I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses, and now I recognize Ranking Member Gosar for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank our witnesses for being here today. The subcommittee will consider H.R. 3405, the Uranium Classification Act of 2019, which seeks to remove uranium from the Department of Interior's list of 35 mineral commodities deemed critical to the economic and national security of the United States. Uranium is a uniquely valuable element, providing a source of clean energy and fulfilling a variety of irreplaceable non-fuel and defense applications. We have had multiple hearings in the subcommittee on mining critical minerals and the increasing problems of our import reliance. The current administration is taking greatly needed steps to address this issue, starting with the President's executive order in December of 2017 to create the list we are discussing today. Just a few weeks ago, a comprehensive report was released by the Department of Commerce, detailing several strategies to support the stability and independence of our domestic critical mineral supply chain. This report was the result of a thorough government-wide consultation process with the Department of Interior, the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and several other agencies. One of the metrics for placing a commodity on a critical mineral list was an evaluation of the relative vulnerability of its supply chains. My friends on the other side of the aisle seem to have an unusual definition of what supply chain vulnerability means. Mr. Grijalva's bill says that the United States uranium supply chain is not vulnerable to disruption, despite the fact that 93 to 97% of our demand for uranium is being met by foreign imports. As the chairman said, coming from Australia and Canada, but the only mine in Canada is now closed. Production from domestic uranium mines was 33% lower in 2018 than it was in 2017, and it's projected to fall even further this year. If this trend continues in a few short years, domestic production will disappear entirely. This is not the first time members of the majority have ignored global realities to attempt to undermine domestic uranium productions. Just a few weeks ago, this committee held a hearing on the so-called Grand Canyon Centennial Protection Act, which would permanently lock away critical and strategic minerals on a 1 million plus acre swath of land in my home state of Arizona. The area referenced in that bill, far outside the Grand Canyon, contains the largest tract of uranium deposits in the country and the highest grades of American uranium ore by a factor of 6. The withdrawal area constitutes the bulk of 326 million acres of uranium reserve, which the Nuclear Energy Institute estimates would provide California's 45 million residents 22 and a half years of electricity. Perhaps the most concerning part of this issue is that the largest uranium produced in the world is Kazakhstan. Russia and Kazakhstan collectively supply 20% of the uranium imported by the United States. These two countries have been moving to essentially corner the global uranium market, bringing down the price of commodity to artificially low levels, effectively driving competitors out of the business. China and Russia have begun to collaborate on this goal, with China buying up uranium mines in Namibia. The U.S. is fortunate enough today to be able to import from allies like Canada and Australia, but that future is far from certain. Market manipulations have coincided with uranium mine closures in those countries as well. For example, Canada, as I discussed earlier, closed its McArthur River mine just last year, which was responsible for about 15% of global production, and leaves just one operational uranium mine in the country. I'd like to take note that this mine closure took place after the important reliance statistic for 2017 were analyzed, and therefore any major shifts in global uranium supply that may result are not accounted for in this legislation. Should this bill go into effect, we wouldn't be able to effectively respond to a sudden change in global supply in the future. Unfortunately, the bill goes beyond just removing uranium from the critical minerals list. It also prevents it from ever being added back, with no exceptions for national or international emergency situations. It's always important to consider any national or international security implications when constructing public policy, which this bill clearly has done. Like H.R. 1373, this legislation is another attack on the people of my district. The bill ignores science as well as the economic and national security of the United States, all in the name of pandering to extremist special interest groups, which we'll hear from today. Mr. Chairman, minerals on the critical mineral list should be based on need, actual science, and the recommendation of experts throughout the country and our federal agencies. Individual members of Congress seeking to appease donors is the absolute worst way to develop or modify the critical minerals list. This bill should be rejected on that basis alone, despite its numerous flaws. I strongly oppose to this unscientific legislation, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. That's true too. Testifying on our first panel today is Dr. Stephen Fortier. Dr. Fortier is the director of the National Minerals Information Center at the U.S. Geological Survey. Dr. Fortier, you are recognized for 5 minutes of testimony.
Good morning, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, and members of the subcommittee. And thank you for the opportunity to provide comment on H.R. 3405, the Uranium Classification Act of 2019. The Department of Interior manages 1/5 of the nation's lands as well as the nation's offshore energy and minerals. These responsibilities include leasing and permitting activities for both onshore and offshore access to and development of the nation's mineral resources through the Bureau of Land Management and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. The U.S. Geological Survey conducts scientific research on how mineral resources form geologically, provides earth science-based assessments on the geologic potential for mineral commodity occurrences across the nation and globe, and provides statistics on the worldwide supply, demand, consumption, and flow of mineral commodities essential to the nation's economy and national security. Executive Order 13817, a federal strategy to ensure secure and reliable supply of critical minerals, was issued on December 20, 2017. The EO identified the heavy reliance of the United States on foreign sources of mineral commodities that are vital to the nation's security and economic interests as a source of strategic vulnerabilities. The EO defined a critical mineral as 1, a non-fuel mineral or mineral material essential to the economic and national security of the United States, 2, the supply chain of which is vulnerable to disruption, and 3, that serves an essential function in the manufacturing of a product, the absence of which would have significant consequences for our economy or our national security. The order instructed the Secretary of the Interior, in coordination with the Secretary of Defense and in consultation with the heads of other relevant departments and agencies, to publish a list of critical minerals in the Federal Register not later than 60 days after the date of the order. The list of critical minerals resulting from the interagency process is quite broad, containing a total of 35 minerals and mineral groups, reflecting the broad interests and missions of multiple contributing departments and agencies. Over the past 10 years, since the publication of the National Research Council report, Minerals, Critical Minerals, and the U.S. Economy by the National Academies, more than 30 critical mineral evaluations have been conducted by government agencies, private companies, academics, and nonprofits. None of these studies has the same materials on the resulting lists. All differ in some way that depends on the perspective of the organization asking the question. It should come as a surprise to no one that the broad interests of multiple U.S. government agencies has resulted in a broad list of minerals considered critical, The inclusion of uranium on the critical minerals list was the result of several factors. Early in the interagency process, the point was made that there are important non-fuel uses for uranium in defense, energy, medical, and space applications. Such uses in ammunition, radiation shielding, production of medical isotopes, and as a metal alloy are clearly non-fuel applications. Uranium is produced from uranium ore deposits and is clearly a mineral or mineral material, if not by legal definition, then certainly by any objective scientific definition. In addition, it is impossible to ignore the national security implications of a failure by the U.S. government to ensure a secure and reliable supply of uranium for this country. The categorization of uranium as a purely non-fuel mineral is not factually correct, is a very narrow definition, and one that was not adopted by the interagency group. The two principal quantitative metrics used in developing the critical minerals list, U.S. import reliance and the country concentration of production, are objective statistical criteria. Based on data from the Energy Information Administration, the import reliance for uranium was 95% in 2016, and it has averaged between 90 and 95% for the past several years. The fact is, the U.S. is heavily reliant on imports for uranium. In fact, uranium production in the U.S. is at or near all-time lows, according to EIA. In addition, despite claims to the contrary, production of uranium is in fact highly concentrated, including large quantities coming from Kazakhstan, Russia, and other former Soviet Union states, where state-owned or sponsored companies are gaining global market share at the expense of U.S. and other market-based producers. To conclude, the development of the critical minerals list in response to Executive Order 13817 was done through an interagency process, as required, using the best information available at the time. It reflects the broad interests of multiple U.S. government stakeholders and will be reviewed and updated every 2 years per the strategy report issued by the Department of Commerce on June 4, 2019. The inclusion of uranium on the critical minerals list was based on 1, the existence of important non-fuel applications, 2, high levels of U.S. import reliance, 3, high global production concentration, and 4, the importance of uranium for national security. The Department appreciates the opportunity to review and comment on the legislation. The bill, as proposed, would remove uranium from the administration's final list of critical minerals. In my testimony, I have explained the reasoning behind its inclusion. The Department believes its inclusion is merited and therefore opposes the legislation. Thank you for the opportunity to present on behalf of the U.S. Geological Survey on the important subject of critical minerals. I will be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Fortier. I remind members of the committee that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask witnesses, and I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Fortier, I'm going to follow your reasoning how uranium ended up on the critical minerals list. We know that uranium did not meet the threshold to be included under the screening tool, but a letter we received from DOI said minerals could be added based on the judgment of, quote, subject matter experts of the U.S. Geological Service. Which subject matter experts were involved in that?
I believe the language you're referring to refers to subject matter experts generally, not just USGS. There were a number of subject matter experts from the interagency group that worked on the critical minerals list, including from national security-related departments. So it's not just USGS subject matter experts that we are referring to.
Could you provide the committee with the names of those experts?
I'm not prepared to do that here. Certainly, there's documentation of the people that were involved in that process.
Well, we're not asking you to do it here, but we would like you to submit that list to the committee.
I think I can't submit documents directly to the subcommittee. If you would like documents from the Department of Interior, I think you have to work through the proper channels at Interior.
Thank you. The letter also mentions, quotes, representatives from other DOI bureaus. Who were these representatives? What bureaus are we talking about?
Well, Interior has a number of bureaus that have interests in critical minerals, including USGS, but also the Bureau of Land Management and the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, who have significant equities in this space.
Okay. Same letter says that various inputs from DOD were also used in adding uranium to the list. Could you clarify? What were those, quotes, various inputs?
I think it's perhaps not unreasonable for the Department of Defense not to wish to specify what their inputs were in this process. If you'd like to know what their inputs were, I would suggest you ask them. Thank you.
Yes, we would. Was there any dissent within USGS regarding the inclusion of uranium?
There was a discussion, and a robust discussion, I will say. I think in the end, the arguments that people made about important non-fuel mineral applications, high import reliance, high country concentration, and the importance of uranium, unmistakable importance of uranium to national security, were the deciding factors for the decision.
Did anyone within the government push back against the addition of uranium to the critical minerals list?
I don't recall people telling us to take it off the list within government.
What other minerals didn't pass the initial screening tool but still ended up on the final criteria minerals
I would like to clarify what the initial screening and the screening methodology is and is not. Okay, the NSTC screening methodology is not a critical minerals list. It is a methodology that uses trends in mineral supply, demand, and consumption data to identify trends in mineral supply chains that should prompt us to further evaluate whether we have an emerging supply risk. So it is not really intended to be a critical minerals list, although it's often interpreted that way. That is not what it is. It also is not country specific, and so it was inadequate to be able to develop a critical minerals list for this use because the executive order in the opening sentence identifies import reliance as a source of strategic vulnerabilities. That metric is not in the original screening methodology developed by NSTC.
Thank you. You know, I want to change the topic. Graham, just slightly, it's still relevant. Chairman Grijalva and I sent a letter to Interior over a month ago asking for the documents behind the decision to include uranium. Can you tell me when we're going to get a response?
I cannot tell you that. I think you need to take that up with congressional and legislative affairs people at the department.
Well, we've been taking it up, and what we've been hearing from the department is that it's in progress. All we'd like you to know is if you would go back and within a week find out where it is within the progress.
I will take your message back to the department, Chairman Lowenthal.
Well, thank you, and I yield back. Mr. Lamborn, the chair recognizes you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and this is an important issue. Critical and strategic minerals is something that this subcommittee has been working on for many years. This bill has some real problems, though. I can't see any way that it's ever going to become law, but we do need to discuss it because it's an important debate. Doctor, you testified that I'm going to change subjects here. According to the Energy Information Agency, in 2018, domestic production in the U.S. of uranium was at the lowest rate in 70 years. So what percentage of uranium is in our country is domestically produced versus foreign produced?
I don't have the exact numbers, and USGS does not cover uranium the way it does nearly 90 other mineral commodities, so I'm not an expert on the current statistics. But it's clear from the EIA data that for the past several years, less than 10% of domestic consumption of uranium has been as a result of domestic mining.
And so Kazakhstan and Russia are two of the biggest suppliers of uranium to the U.S. Is that not true?
I'm not sure what their exact percentages are of supply to the U.S. My understanding is that most of our uranium comes from Australia and Canada today. I would point out, however, that globally, the supply of uranium is dominated by Kazakhstan first and foremost, in addition to other former Soviet republics, and that domestic producers and our allied producers from whom we are sourcing imports are under the same global economic pressures as producers in the U.S. So it is quite clear, I think, that the continued reliance on allied supplies of these materials is something that we have to be very concerned about. Those supplies are at risk just as they are in the U.S.
Thank you for pointing that out. Taking Russia in mind, Kazakhstan in mind, and China in mind, why did the department, in consultation with other key departments and agencies, conclude that the supply chain for uranium is vulnerable to disruption?
I think it goes back to what I just said about the market-based producers in the U.S., in Canada, and Australia competing with state-owned enterprises and state-sponsored companies in Kazakhstan, and other former Soviet republics who don't have the same environmental standards and constraints, don't have the same view of labor issues and public safety and health. These companies are competing with those state-owned enterprises and state-sponsored companies, and they are at a clear disadvantage. We have seen this in commodity after commodity. This is how we got in the situation we're in on rare earths, for example. We are being undercut by production in China that is being done under conditions and under circumstances that we would not tolerate in this country.
That's a really good point, and we had an interesting hearing a week ago in this subcommittee on a an attempt to ban offshore drilling, and that would just drive oil and gas production offshore to countries like Nigeria, Venezuela, other countries that have very low environmental standards compared to the U.S. And there's no question that in the past, uranium mining in this country has had problems, but I think we've learned from those problems. And how can you compare U.S. mining quality and environmental regulations versus countries like China, Russia, and Kazakhstan?
I'm not familiar with their exact policies and practices, but I do know that we have some of the highest environmental standards in the world, and other countries clearly do not. There is, I think, abundant evidence of the mining industry in China behaving in a way that is completely unsustainable, and I think the Chinese government is starting to recognize that. So, but the U.S. has among the highest environmental standards in the world.
And I'll finish with this. This bill proposes taking uranium off of the critical mineral list forever. Isn't this list supposed to change and evolve over time as conditions and trends and uses of minerals changes? And shouldn't there be more flexibility than just banning one substance forever off this list?
That's really not for me to decide, but you are correct that the list is to be reviewed and reevaluated and reissued every 2 years to reflect current technological and supply chain issues.
Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes Mr. Cunningham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. Fortier, for attending here today. I would like to yield to balance my time back to the chairman.
Dr. Fortier. Dr. Fortier, was the uranium industry involved in the last-minute decision to add uranium to the critical minerals list?
They were not. I've never had a conversation with a uranium domestic mining company ever. They were not involved in the decision.
Then have you heard anything from the uranium mining industry, how they feel about the final critical minerals list? Whether
I don't believe I have. I don't think I've heard any feedback from the domestic mining industry, uranium industry.
So you haven't had any contact at all? You don't know how they feel? They're probably opposed to adding the liquid.
I haven't had any contact with the domestic mining, uranium mining industry.
I'd like to yield my remaining time of questions now to I yield to Representative DeGette. No? Yield. I yield in time. And now I recognize Mr. Hurd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Gosar, and our witness for being here today to testify on the Uranium Classification Act of 2019. This bill would direct a revision of USGS's final list of critical minerals of striking uranium from the list. This would be very detrimental to Americans' domestic uranium supply and would make us more reliant on foreign imports. Even still, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have pushed legislation which would do nothing more than build up this reliance and hurt our national security. And my first question would be, I'm sorry, let me just read something here right now. You've got a significant experience in this area, and in your testimony, the lack of flexibility, I'd like to get your ideas on what this restriction, removing it from the list, what you see that would happen to the overall impact of a uranium supply in the United States.
Thank you. That's a good question, Congressman Hearn. I appreciate the opportunity to address that. First, I would like to say that, with all due respect, this is not a USGS critical minerals list. It's not a Department of Interior critical minerals list. It is an interagency generated critical minerals list that was led by the Department of Interior and USGS. I just want to be clear about that. It was an interagency process. I really wouldn't want to speculate about what would happen if you take it off the list. I think, our approach to this is to look at it very specifically in terms of, is this a mineral that has important non-fuel uses? The answer is yes. Are we highly import reliant? Yes, we are. Is the supply concentrated globally? Yes, we are. It is. And is it important for national security? Yes, it is. I think we have seen with other materials when we allow these circumstances to persist and fester, that over a period of years we become more and more vulnerable until we get in a position where we are today with rare earths, where there's a sort of crisis again after 10 years, where we have not secured the supply of these materials outside of countries that do not share our values, and that we are experiencing a strategic vulnerability because of that. That's the way we view this issue.
Would you, to elaborate on that a little bit further, would you say that this pathway is very dangerous in a sense? You just mentioned rare earth elements. Coupling it with that, we've heard a lot in the news lately regarding China's possible intent to hold us hostage, maybe even geopolitical blackmail, if you will, in order to get what they want to prevent us from doing what's necessary to protect our national security interests. Is this taking this off the list, is that a possibility? Do you see that as a segue into other items being taken off the list as well?
I'm not sure that it relates to other items on the list, but it is clear, I think, that the current supply situation is not one that we can assume is sustainable in the long term. As I mentioned, market-based producers in the U.S., Canada, and Australia are under the same global economic pressures from state-owned enterprises and state-sponsored companies in countries such as Kazakhstan and other former Soviet republics. And a natural consequence of production capacity continuing to shut down in allied countries is an increasing dependence on, for those materials on non-allied countries.
So not to be left out, China sees this as a possibility and have recently or are currently in the process of buying mines or acquiring mines in Namibia. Is that correct? Do you understand it?
I think it is fair to say that China clearly recognizes what their domestic mineral raw material requirements are and is aggressively pursuing their interests in this sphere.
So you could see two state-owned organizations in Russia/Kazakhstan and China pushing out the rest of the world's supply so that we're solely dependent on people who are not necessarily friendly to us.
I wouldn't ascribe motives to the activities of other countries. I would leave that to others. What is clear is that over time, you see in commodity after commodity, increasing concentration of production in particular countries. We have seen this repeatedly for dozens of mineral commodities in China, and it has resulted in a pronounced increase in U.S. dependence on China over the past 20 years in particular. And that is a trend that we track at USGS and that we bring to people's attention every year. It is up to Congress and others to decide how to act on that information and to ascribe motives to the actors involved.
Thank you, Dr. Fortier. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Representative DeGette for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Dr. Fortier, welcome. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the categorization of uranium as a critical mineral. As you know, in May 2018, USGS categorized uranium as a critical mineral, which made it eligible for fast-track approval. So that seemed a little odd to me because I don't think that uranium meets the definition of critical mineral in Executive Order 13817, which lays out a federal strategy for ensuring reliable supplies of critical minerals. The executive order said that for something to be a critical mineral, it either has to be a non-fuel mineral or a mineral. And the mineral material. The Materials Act of 1947 defines mineral materials as, quote, common varieties of sandstone, gravel, pumice, pumicite, cinders, and clay. So I wanted to ask you, Dr. Fortier, does uranium meet that definition of mineral material? Is it one of the common varieties of sandstone, gravel, pumice, pumicite, cinders, or clay?
I don't think we consider it a mineral material. The
So
question,
the answer would be no, right?
the question,
No, yes or no will work.
okay, it's not a mineral material.
Thank you. Now, given that the Mining and Minerals Policy of 1970 defines uranium as a mineral fuel, wouldn't it be fair to say that this means uranium is a fuel mineral rather than a non-fuel mineral?
The Mining and Mineral Policy Act does say, for the purposes of this act,
Uranium is a mineral fuel, right?
yes.
Okay. So both in law and reality, uranium is neither a non-fuel mineral nor a mineral material. Isn't that right?
As I've said in my testimony, there are important non-fuel applications for uranium, and
I completely, well, like what?
in defense, energy, space, and medical applications. For example, production of
But
medical
uranium's
isotopes.
also used as fuel, right?
Nobody is arguing that.
Yes or no will work.
Okay. Yes, it's principally used as a fuel.
Principally used as fuel.
Yes.
Now, let me ask you this. Is uranium defined as a critical material in any of the following reports? Minerals, Critical Minerals and the U.S. Economy, published by the National Academy of Sciences, 2008. Energy Critical Elements, published by the American Physical Society and Materials Research Society in 2011. The Critical Mineral Strategy, released by the Department of Energy in 2015, and the Critical Mineral Resources of the United States, which was published by our own agency, the USGS, one day before the release of Executive Order 13817. Do you know whether in any of those reports uranium is defined as a critical material? Yes or no will work.
It is not.
Okay. Are you aware of any reputable report on critical minerals that includes uranium as one of those minerals?
I would object to the reputable part of that. The U.S. I believe.
Well, I
the
mean, I'm
critical
asking
minerals
for your
list-
opinion. In your opinion,
I don't really have an opinion on that.
okay. Is there any report, reputable or not, that refers to uranium as a critical mineral?
I believe the critical minerals list that was issued as part of the critical minerals, response to the critical minerals executive order is a
So you're
credible
referring
report.
back to the executive order that calls it is there a report that you know of that supports that definition?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. So how then did it end up on the USGS critical minerals list?
Okay.
By executive order?
If I'm allowed to have more than a one-word answer, I will explain that.
Go ahead.
It wound up on the critical minerals list, as I have said, because there are important non-fuel uses for uranium, because the U.S. is heavily import reliant for its supply of uranium. Production concentration is heavily concentrated globally, and the importance to national security is high. That's
Gotcha.
how it reminds.
Gotcha. But so even though uranium doesn't meet the definition of a critical material set out by the executive order, it's now on a fast track for authorization to new uranium mining. And here's why I'm concerned. I'm concerned because there's still 15,000 abandoned uranium mines in the western United States. 75% are on federal and tribal land in the Four Corner states, including in my home state of Colorado. And I think what we should be doing is focusing on addressing the public health impacts of the abandoned mines, not opening new mines to mining, and I yield back.
Thank you, and the chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much. Dr. Fortier, we're going to step back for a second. And my colleague, Mr. Hearn, started down this line. So when we look at monopolies of rare earths, how did it start? Did it start by China gathering all the resources around the world for rare earths? Is that one of the ways that they started?
I think it started domestically with production, as it was the case for many commodities in China.
In fact, a lot of those primary mine aspects were undermined by and bought by China. Is that true?
China has pursued a very aggressive strategy in developing the supply of its own mineral requirements. They clearly understand what they need, and they have a strategy for achieving it.
And you're familiar with One Belt, One Road?
Yes.
Yeah, so what the exchange there is for infrastructure, the country leverages their natural resources. So what ends up happening in this country is they have so much of that market that what they do is they can raise the price very slowly till it reaches a point where another mine, like say in California or Montana, want to jump into the arena. And once they use their finances to get started, they flood the market so that it wipes them out. And then most of the time, they come back in and buy the mine. So they once again get ownership of it. Is that true?
I would say that it is clear that China has an outsized impact on the market because of the size of their economy and the consumption requirements that they have. Anything that China does in the mining space has an impact around the rest of the world.
Now, last I looked at the empirical chart, uranium is like copper, right? It's on that chart.
We don't cover uranium in USGS the same way that we do the other mineral commodities. That's why we relied on Energy Information Administration data for the critical minerals list.
Are you aware that China has been working with Russia and Kazakhstan in regards to looking at monopolization of the uranium market?
I'm not familiar with that interaction.
Gotcha. Are you familiar with Uranium One?
The name is familiar, but I'm not.
Oh, it's one of those things that we up in Wyoming in the Powder River area, what we did is we sold off about a quarter of our uranium to the Russian government. You familiar with that? Does it ring a bell now?
I didn't hear the question.
We sold off under the Obama administration through Ms. Clinton, Uranium One, which is a quarter of our, if I'm not mistaken, of our uranium surplus. Are you familiar with that?
I've heard of that, yes. I'm not an expert on that issue.
Okay. In my remaining time, what are some of the other uses for uranium other than a fuel?
So there are in uses as in ammunition, for the production of medical isotopes, as an alloy, metal alloy, radiation shielding. And this is what was raised early in the interagency process as in the discussion of uranium being more than simply a fuel mineral. No one is arguing that it isn't used as a fuel mineral, it's clear, but there are important non-fuel mineral uses for uranium. That is also clear.
Are you familiar with an article by the Quillette by Mr. Schellenberger, Michael Schellenberger, that talks about in the Green New Deal, there's no possibility that the Green New Deal can work unless it actually has uranium in it and nuclear?
I'm not familiar with that, no.
I'd like to submit that for the record. So ordered. So when you went through this supply chain evaluation between energy and interior, what were some of the concerns that they brought up specifically?
Yes, well, the concerns were principally that there are important non-fuel mineral uses for uranium, and that it is impossible to talk about national security as it relates to the supply of mineral raw materials without considering uranium. I think the national security implications of a secure and reliable supply of uranium are pretty clear. And that is the view of the interagency group.
Well, my time is out, so I yield back.
Thank you, and that concludes your testimony, Dr. Fortier. Yes? Okay. The chair recognizes Chairman Grijalva.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd indicated that I didn't have a question, but I have two brief ones for the gentleman. In the assessment leading to uranium on the critical minerals list, the two issues that you've repeated through much of the responses has been factors that were added into it other than the original report from your agency that said it wasn't a critical mineral, was the issue of foreign dependency and the potential disruption of supply line, and national security / defense, because by implication, when we talk about a non-fuel, we're talking about weapons development and weapons for national security, if I'm not mistaken. My question is, other consequences, since those were assessments that were added to it beyond your report that didn't consider it a critical mineral, those two assessments, consequences, other assessments, social cost, cleanup, abandoned mines, the technology, the safety, the potential watershed contamination, those kinds of issues that have great implications for both public health and sustainability for the American people themselves as we go forward on this issue. Were those part of the assessment process? Yes, no?
Those are not part of the criteria.
So the criteria was commodity, demand, and those two assessment
The
areas.
criteria are import reliance and country concentration principally.
Waste disposal, any of that was not part of the discussion.
It really is not in the scope of what we were asked to do in the executive order.
As part of the uranium supply and national security, operational quotas. The industry asked for 25% of Buy America. That would be a great stimulus to the mining of uranium, insofar as in 2018, it's one of its lowest points, the highest point being at the height of the Cold War, when weapon development was the main source, the main use for the uranium that was being mined. Do you think a quota system to guarantee, is that a necessary stimulus for increasing the domestic supply?
The discussion of quota system for uranium was not part of the discussion about whether to put critical minerals.
In your own mind, is that a good stimulus to get the commodity moving again?
I really don't have any involvement in that, in trade and other related issues, industrial policy, mining policy. USGS is a scientific organization, and we really don't have a role there.
Okay. I appreciate it, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the hearing. I think we as members of this committee can't afford to be in just one silo that the witness is in. I think we've got to look at the breadth of other issues affected by uranium being on the critical minerals list, and I appreciate you holding this hearing. Yield back.
Thank you, and that brings Dr. Fortier's testimony to a conclusion, and I want to thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
And
Chairman.
now I'd like to invite the second panel to take their seats at the witness table.
Is that okay?
Mr. Chairman, while we're waiting for them, can I enter into the record the Arizona Geological Survey for the record, please? Dated April 2011.
So ordered. All right, ready? Welcome. First on our panel, we have Ms. Amber Raimondo, Energy Program Director at the Grand Canyon Trust. Next, we have Dr. Tommy Rock, Postdoctoral Associate at the Rocky Mountain Center for Occupational and Environmental Health. Next is Ms. Sharon Squassoni, Research Professor at the George Washington University School of International Affairs. And then on the concluding, we have Dr. William Schneider, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. Let me remind the witnesses that they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the lights on the witness table in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the yellow light will come on. Your time will have expired when the red light comes on, and I'm going to please ask you to complete your statement. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. The chair now recognizes Ms. Raimondo to testify.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, and committee members for this opportunity to speak in support of the Uranium Classification Act of 2019. I'm Amber Raimondo, the Energy Program Director for the Grand Canyon Trust. The Trust is a regional conservation organization based in Flagstaff, Arizona. Our mission is to safeguard the wonders of the Grand Canyon and the Colorado Plateau while supporting the rights of its native peoples. We've been working to protect the Grand Canyon and broader Colorado Plateau from the threats of uranium mining and milling for much of the past 30 years. The Grand Canyon Trust supports H.R. 3405 and its directive to the Secretary of the Interior to remove uranium from the critical minerals list. The administration's goal in placing uranium on the critical minerals list was to encourage more uranium mining by relaxing legal safeguards meant to check the damage the mining industry causes. But as the Trust has outlined in a recent report, the Grand Canyon and Colorado Plateau have already suffered far too much from uranium's toxic legacy, and curtailing the safeguards that exist will only make things worse. It's this cost of calling uranium a critical mineral that I'm here to talk about today. Past uranium mining and milling activities have exacted a serious toll across the Colorado Plateau. The damage is especially evident on and near Native American lands. The full cost of the uranium business isn't borne by the mining companies who profit in the short term and eventually move on, for they leave behind a bill to be picked up by the American people who pay for contamination with their health, lives, and tax dollars. Uranium mining companies often dismiss past contamination as merely a product of a bygone era that lacked the protection of modern environmental regulations. But just as traffic laws are no guarantee against car accidents, environmental laws are no guarantee against irreversible contamination, especially not when those laws are curtailed. And unlike a fender bender, uranium pollution remains a threat for many generations into the future. Americans are still grappling with the devastation of the uranium operations from the last time the government propped up the uranium industry. Cleanup of Orphan Mine, for example, located on the edge of Grand Canyon's South Rim, has so far cost taxpayers $15 million. The Park Service warns hikers not to drink from a creek below the mine unless, quote, death by thirst is the only other option. Today, the Navajo Nation has over 500 abandoned uranium mines in need of cleanup. Regulatory agencies have entered into $1.7 billion in enforcement agreements and settlements for the cleanup of fewer than half the remaining sites. In 2008, government agencies identified 29 water sources on the Navajo Nation with uranium and other radionuclide levels in excess of drinking water standards. A 2016 study by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention surveyed 599 people on the Navajo Nation and found that 27% of them had high levels of uranium in their urine, compared to 5% of the entire U.S. population. The same study has also found uranium in the bodies of infants on Navajo Nation. So perhaps it's no surprise that in 2005, the Navajo Nation banned uranium mining on their lands. There are also many examples of problems at more recently developed mines. A 1984 flash flood washed ore from the Hat Canyon mines on the north rim of the Grand Canyon into Kanab Creek, a major tributary of the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon. And while the Pine Nut uranium mine sat idle on the north rim, the capped mine shaft unexpectedly filled with nearly 3 million gallons of water, which were contaminated by exposed uranium ore. Nearby, radioactive dust at the Kanab North uranium mine has blown from the mine site into the surrounding ecosystem, and 2.5 years ago, at the Canyon mine near Grand Canyon's south rim, miners digging the mine shaft pierced an underground aquifer, which the company claimed would not produce significant water. But so far, over 18 million gallons of water and counting have flowed into that mine shaft. The Colorado Plateau has also been home to at least 22 uranium mills. 4 of them were on Navajo lands. All of them left a toxic legacy. Today, only one, the White Mesa Mill in rural southeastern Utah, owned and operated by a company called Energy Fuels, is still operational. It sits right next door to the Ute Mountain Ute tribal community of White Mesa. Groundwater flows south from the mill toward the community. A shallow groundwater aquifer directly beneath the mill is contaminated with several pollutants, and regular groundwater monitoring has consistently turned up results over the legal threshold for several toxic constituents, including uranium, and groundwater quality in the area continues to decline. Cleaning up and maintaining the other 21 mill sites has already cost Americans billions of dollars, far exceeding the selling price of the uranium that was milled at those sites. So to protect the well-being of American citizens and places as majestic as the Grand Canyon, we cannot afford to eliminate safeguards against the risks of deadly, everlasting, and expensive contamination, particularly when so many Americans are already living with the consequences of the last government-subsidized uranium boom. That is justification enough to remove uranium from the critical minerals list. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Dr. Tommy Rock, the postdoctoral associate at the Rocky Mountain Center for Occupational and Environmental Health. Welcome, Dr. Rock.
Thank you, Chairman Grohova, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, and members of the committee for inviting me to testify today. My name is Dr. Tommy Rock. I am an environmental scientist from Mining Valley, Utah, located on the Navajo Nation. I oppose any new uranium mining, and I'll explain why. I've been involved in uranium research since 2006 and have seen the devastation this mineral can cause. Many Navajos have worked in uranium mining and milling and have passed on due to cancer, such as my late grandfather, Shorty Holiday. He first served as a World War II veteran, then worked at the mine. He died of bone cancer. He talked about the constant pain he was in. While I currently serve as a member of the Uranium Remediation Advisory Commission, my testimony today reflects my own views and does not reflect the views or position of the Navajo Nation, the Navajo Nation Environmental Protection Agency, or the Uranium Remediation Advisory Commission. I oppose uranium mining because people who reside in the Perkle River Valley see a higher incidence of cancer due to elevated level of uranium in their groundwater. I discovered public water contamination in 2015 when we worked for the Tiny Lake Enterprise, got an environmental justice grant about past uranium mining and milling. The dam broke in July of 1979, and yet I still get emails from former residents of the area that have cancer saying, "Why me?" I do not know how to answer them, but I know the science is clear. The contaminated runoff from uranium mining has degraded the Perkle River for decades have negatively impacted the people that rely on it, not to mention the catastrophic events such as a breach in the dam from the Church Rock mill that spewed radioactive waste through the Perkle River watershed. This contamination from routine mill operation, unforeseen events, and insufficient remediation of mining activity disproportionately affects tribal communities, and it must be addressed before any new uranium mine or mill is approved. Comprehensive cleanup of a uranium mining operation is near impossibility, and once the operability of the mill is gone, the cost of emergent health impacts to the community and are often ultimately shouldered by taxpayers. There are currently 503 abandoned uranium mines on the Navajo Nation alone, which demonstrate this is not a small, isolated, but one that has widespread effect on our community. Despite the fact that uranium mining on public land pays zero in royalties as long as the outdated 1872 mining law remains in place, somehow when weighed against the interests of the extraction industry, our opinion on future mining and the poison of my people is rarely considered. The threat of uranium mining to a sacred landscape such as the Bears Ears is very real. Currently, more than 200 uranium mining claims exist on lands illegally cut from the Bears Ears National Monument in 2017. Should domestic uranium codes be enacted, these claims could become full-fledged mining operations, spreading contamination throughout the San Juan River watershed. In one example, the Denros mine had been scheduled to permanently close and be remediated in 2025. But in February of 2018, the Bureau of Land Management approved the owner's plan to extend the life of the mine for additional 13 years increase production from 100,000 tons to 500,000 tons of ore, and expand the footprint of the mine tenfold. This type of rush to make public lands open for business will make our community sick, discourage revenues from recreation, and ultimately be the government's responsibility to clean up. There are currently studies underway utilizing traditional ecological knowledge to approach cleanup. This type of research looks at the different pathway exposure using risk assessment, which is needed to fully understand the holistic risks. Native Americans have a different relationship with the environment, where they use the whole environment and recognize the interrelationship of the environment with the people depend upon it. The Navajo people and all indigenous people are being ignored, both in our expertise in cleaning up the mess left by the uranium mining when we are being most impacted. But we are also being ignored in our request to protect our land from future uranium mining. Places like the Grand Canyon, the Bears Ears are not appropriate for uranium mining now, and they never will be. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rock. The chair now recognizes Ms. Squassoni to testify.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal and Ranking Member Gosar and committee members for inviting me here today. I would like to submit a longer statement for the record, as well as 2 publications that cover uranium governance in the U.S., if that's okay. Thank you. The federal strategy to ensure secure and reliable supplies of critical minerals assumes that dependence on foreign sources of certain minerals undermines national security. In my longer statement, for the record, I address some of these assumptions, but for now, I will limit my remarks on whether uranium should be included on the critical minerals list. The short answer is an unqualified no. Uranium meets none of the criteria for a critical mineral as defined by Executive Order 13817. It is not a non-fuel mineral or mineral material. Its supply chain is not vulnerable to disruption, and it does not serve, and I quote, an essential function in the manufacturing of a product, the absence of which would have significant consequences for our economy or national security. I will address each of these in turn. Uranium does indeed have non-fuel uses, but these are dwarfed by its use as a fuel for nuclear power, particularly in the United States, which generates 25 to 30% of global nuclear electricity. Enriched, that is highly enriched uranium, is still used in nuclear weapons, but we have 586 tons of highly enriched uranium in the stockpile, which is enough roughly for about 23,000 additional nuclear weapons. In short, the United States has been awash in enriched uranium for decades, and we stopped producing for weapons the year after I was born. The aerospace, defense, and energy uses cited as non-fuel applications for uranium actually almost all involve uranium as fuel. There are 2 exceptions: the military uses of depleted uranium, that is armor and armor-piercing projectiles, and medical radioisotopes. For medical radioisotopes, the enriched uranium targets are irradiated. Legally, as Congressmen have noted, uranium was classified as a mineral fuel by the Mining and Minerals Policy Act of 1970, and this may explain why government entities have also tended to treat uranium as a mineral fuel. Even the industry, the World Nuclear Association, claims on its website that the only substantial use for uranium is as fuel in nuclear reactors, mostly for electricity generation. Despite receiving 183 comments requesting the Department of Interior to take uranium off the critical minerals list because it is not a non-fuel mineral, the department chose to keep it on, stating that uranium had non-fuel uses. This defies common sense. Uranium is not particularly vulnerable to supply disruptions. Geologically, it is nearly ubiquitous. It is more common than tin, but slightly less common than copper or zinc. According to the WNA, quantities of mineral resources are greater than commonly perceived and are relative to both market prices and cost of extraction. This is important because the way to avoid supply disruptions is to diversify supply. As with all mining, some supply disruptions occur with mine flooding or other environmental issues. But uranium can be stockpiled, and utilities and converters keep 3 times as much as they need on hand. The supply chain vulnerability for nuclear energy occurs further up the supply chain. And with respect to potential disruptions, U.S. utilities procure about 55% of their uranium needs from Canada and Australia. For non-fuel uses of uranium, supply is also not vulnerable to disruption. For depleted uranium, the U.S. holds 40% of the global supply. For targets to produce medical radioisotopes, the quantities are minuscule. One company uses about 3 grams of highly enriched uranium or 16 grams of low-enriched uranium for targets. And while the actual supply of medical radioisotopes is vulnerable, the uranium target supply is not. Finally, uranium does not serve as an essential function in the manufacturing of a product unless you consider energy services as a product. This distinction between product and service may be why minerals are grouped into fuel and non-fuel categories and underscores why uranium should be taken off the critical minerals list. If considering the energy services, nuclear energy is one of the ways to produce electricity, even if it provides 20% of the total. But the example of Japan after Fukushima suggests that substitutes are possible, if not desirable. An alternative approach would be to promote secure supply as being reliable, adequate, and affordable, without prejudice to whether such supply is domestic or foreign. In the case of uranium for fuel, secure supply should encompass not just uranium mining and milling, but also conversion, enrichment, and fuel fabrication services, since U.S. nuclear power plants depend on low-enriched uranium fuel. In sum, uranium is certainly a strategic material, but its supply is abundant and reliable because major allies have major deposits. It is also affordable, especially from foreign sources. As such, drastic measures such as opening up the Grand Canyon to uranium mining to spur domestic production or creating a quota for domestic production are not only warranted, but they will reduce, not enhance, nuclear security. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Guasoni. The chair now recognizes Dr. Schneider for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome, Dr. Schneider.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the privilege of permitting me to speak here today. I'm a national security specialist. I have served in various capacities in the executive branch of government, and my remarks will be focused on the national security aspects of the subcommittee's work today. The concept of national security has expanded significantly since the end of the Cold War. Before the Cold War, we had recognized from our World War II experience that we needed to change the way we operated. So the National Security Act of 1947 created the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the National Security Council, and the Department of Defense. But after the end of the Cold War, the impact of globalization, the reduction in the barriers to the transfers of technology, and the development of new modes of communication, including networked computers on the internet, have changed the environment fundamentally. The homeland is no longer a sanctuary, as we have seen since 9/11. And the distinctions between domestic and international for national security purposes are of diminishing relevance. Subsequent to the 9/11 events, the recognition that the homeland was part of national security was reflected in the decision by the Congress to create the Department of Homeland Security. In 2013, President Obama, in Presidential Policy Directive 21, linked the critical infrastructure to national security, that is, the civil infrastructure to national security. And as part of that decision in PPB 21, he identified the nuclear national security infrastructure as part of the critical infrastructure. This decision that President Obama took in 21 has been built on by the current administration. And in 2018, the Department of Defense also acknowledged the security aspects of the Belt and Road Initiative, which I will have a little more to say in a moment. In President Obama's decision in 2013, he recognized the role of nuclear power as an essential part of our concept of national security. The 20% share of our electricity production is an even larger fraction of the total base load supply of electricity. But in a recent General Accounting Office study, they showed the vulnerability of the oil and gas pipeline infrastructure that's necessary to keep the oil and gas part of the energy supply safe. So the decision to include nuclear energy in the critical infrastructure is a good one in that it helps maintain primary energy diversity and resilience. In looking at the global market for uranium, other witnesses have recognized the significance of Kazakhstan as the major producer worldwide of uranium. And this fits into the increasing collaboration between Russia and China in the field of nuclear energy. Although it was tended to be swamped by other developments in the news, earlier this month, President Xi and President Putin held a summit meeting where one of the important agreements made was to collaborate on the worldwide propagation of Russian nuclear energy technology into the 100 or so countries that are affiliated with China's Belt and Road project. The supplies that we get from non-state capitalist countries, Australia and Canada, are vulnerable to the same pricing model that the Russian-Kazakhstan collaboration is, where it is an administered price which they will use to manipulate the market to reduce the market share of other participants. And I have in my prepared testimony a graphic that shows that. The increased collaboration has been recognized by the Congress. The passage of the BUILD Act in 2018, which was signed by the President in December, is providing a path to resolve this. We are, as Professor Paul Bracken has indicated, in the second nuclear age, where there's a substantial increase in the amount of activity from countries that are most threatening. As a consequence, I conclude that the military applications are too uncertain and long decision cycle to make decisions now on the hope that the international environment will improve and that we can take uranium off the critical materials list. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Schneider. And I want to thank the panel for their testimony. I want to remind the members of the committee that Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may want to ask witnesses. I recognize Chairman Grijalva for 5 minutes.
Again, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Rock, you're the third generation of your family that has had to deal with the toxic legacy of uranium mining. In your opinion, how do we ensure that your family, the nation itself, Navajo Nation, is still not dealing with this legacy 3 generations from now?
Yes, the way everything's going right now, yes, and the cleanup process is going slow. So yes, I believe it's going to be an ongoing issue for 3 generation, and not only from my tribe, but the regional tribes and other tribes as well as like going all the way up to Pine Ridge as well. They're dealing with the same issue as well.
And in terms of the consultation that occurs with tribes on any of these kinds of developments on or close to Navajo tribal land, That consultation, what has been the part of that? Is the nation been involved in that you know of?
With what's going on in our nation with the cleanup process, there has been consultation with the federal agencies that are involved, like USCPA, Department of Energy, Nuclear Regulatory
On the
Commission.
cleanup?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Raimundo, good to see you again. Looking at the big picture, the Trump administration seems to be taking actions that add up to a wish fulfillment for the uranium mining industry, and in the process threatening public lands with new expedited uranium mining. Taken in totality, can you describe some of these efforts that you're aware of and that the trust has
Sure.
followed?
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva. Yeah, I would be happy to explain some of those actions that have been taken by the current administration. It started probably with the critical minerals executive order that we're here about today. It was signed the day after the USGS updated its own critical minerals list, which did not include uranium. The newly developed list of critical minerals developed by DOI in 2018 newly included uranium. As a result of that list, we saw the critical mineral strategy that was released by the administration at the beginning of this month, which highlights several things of concern, including a recommendation to review, revise, or lift all mining bans related to in areas where critical minerals might be discovered. And that wasn't just limited to a mining ban, a plain mining ban. That includes revisions of national parks and national monuments as well. There were recommendations to streamline permitting in that critical mineral strategy, including considerations for categorical exclusions under the National Environmental Policy Act for, quote, typical mining operations. But that's sort of like telling someone that, that's sort of like an open heart surgeon saying, I'm just going to consider this patient as a typical patient when I'm about to do surgery. Every mine is very different and has different considerations to be made. There was an energy independence executive order signed in 2017 that directed agencies to review political actions impeding energy development, regardless of why those policies or actions were in place in the first place. And as a result of that executive order, the U.S. Forest Service recommended the Grand Canyon mining ban for review and revision. And then, of course, there's the Section 232 investigation that was initiated last year at the request of 2 mining companies. And we're still waiting to hear the outcome of that decision that would result in trade measures that would quickly change the nature of business for uranium mining companies in this country.
And indeed develop that market here in the United States, artificially, I might add, but still, that's right, I was using the word quota, all of a sudden becomes part of the underpinning to stimulate the uranium mining industry.
Yes, it would create a safe corner for the uranium mining companies in the United States to operate, regardless of what the global market looks like.
Kind of a socialism for industry, I guess. Would more uranium mining near the Grand Canyon do anything to address the real or imagined supply concerns that we've heard of today from some of the witnesses? There's questions to you. Thank you.
No, over 99.5% of the apparently economical reserves of uranium that we know about in the United States are located elsewhere, not near the Grand Canyon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have anything else. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes of question.
Dr. Schneider, industry studies have shown devastating economic effects from the current million-plus acre Obama uranium withdrawal in northern Arizona to rural portions of 6 counties in Arizona, Mojave and Coconino, and Utah, Kane, Garfield, San Juan, and Washington, between 2,000 to 4,000 lost jobs and $29 billion in overall economic activity in the region at peak uranium production. I have the Arizona State Land Trust comments from 2011. Hold up for the record.
Yes, so ordered.
The comment letter describes losses to the State Land Trust in the range of $1.5 million to $18.5 million for each individual mine in a Brescia pipe. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit the Arizona Land Trust comments, along with the Native American employees from the White Mesa Mill, for the record.
So ordered.
Dr. Schneider, do you agree that permanently banning uranium development and exploration on the million-plus acre swath of land in northern Arizona would cause great harm to local economies in Utah and Arizona?
Thank you, Mr. Gossard. I share your concern about it. I have not studied the specific impact on employment in those counties. However, I've included in my testimony an aggregate picture of the decline of mining activity, uranium mining activity in the United States, which is highly correlated with employment. And I suspect that if the ban you described were implemented, it would have a stark impact on employment.
Now, we've had multiple hearings in this committee detailing how long it takes to develop hard rock minerals, with permitting taking on average between 7 to 10 years, and the exploration process sometimes lasting multiple decades. And yet we heard testimony today that the U.S. can simply ramp up production of uranium should the need ever arise. Dr. Schneider, if trends in domestic uranium production continue, how much capability will we have to, quote, ramp up production in, say, 5 to 10 years?
I believe that would be very difficult. This is a very long cycle business. I had the privilege of serving on a congressional commission studying the nuclear enterprise, and the enterprise as a whole, from the mining sector through its application to national defense purposes, is a very, very long cycle business. So it's unlikely that in 5 to 10 years the entire enterprise would be up to speed to be able to respond.
Well, we've seen something in my home state of Arizona where we saw the lumber industry being sued out of production. And we're having trouble trying to get them to come back in, as the young lady from the Grand Canyon Trust will attest to. You know, so once again, it's not so easy just to ramp them up. So how long does it take for the uranium for development for military applications?
Well, we have seen circumstances where it takes at least 10 years simply to develop a new weapon application. So when you consider the entire process, we are dealing with a process that may take as long as 2 decades to acquire the materials, fabricate them in ways that are appropriate to the design, and to be able to test and field them.
Dr. Rock, real quickly, in the last 50 years, has the Navajo or the Indian people in this area's life expectancy gone up or down?
Can we say that again?
The average lifetime of the Native Americans in this region, has it increased or gotten shorter?
Life expectancy?
Quick answer is it's gone up. True?
Yes.
Yes, I thank you. Ms. Renando, who pays for your travel to come back and forth to Washington, D.C.?
My organization.
Well, let's follow up on that. Now, the Grand Canyon Trust is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, correct?
That's correct.
Now, in fact, the IRS reported that in 2017, 87.6% of the Grand Canyon Trust funding came from contribution gifts and grants, and less than 13% came from membership dues. Taxpayers are subsidizing a large portion of Grand Canyon Trust's activities through grants and tax-deductible contributions, correct?
We're a nonprofit, just like the
Tax-deductible,
the
they get
table is a
tax-deductible.
nonprofit.
So taxpayers are actually funding you. And then you're flying here and out there to testify against priorities of the people in my district. I think that's kind of interesting. One quick question for you. Is uranium water soluble?
It is.
It is. So the construction of the way this canyon looks like, these breccia pipes, almost every single mine will be the same. Is that true? In the breccia pipes?
I suppose so, yes.
Yes, they are. Very limited and very clean, are they not?
I'm sorry, I don't think I understand that question.
Very efficient and very clean, not like what we're talking about from past uranium extraction.
Are you referring to the type of uranium mining?
Yes, the breccia pipes.
I wouldn't agree that they're especially clean.
It's very clean. Well, and with a little indulgence. Okay, so these concentrated breccia pipes are sitting in horizontal, very concentrated, 6 times concentration of any other known quantity. So when water comes down it dissolves uranium, and that goes into the springs. And you see it throughout the Grand Canyon. So my point is if it's such a big deal, what you ought to be doing is taking the uranium out and allowing for subsurface water to be cleaned to get to subsurface water. So the geology is very specific. The geology is extremely specific on this. And so it makes no sense what you're coming with your conversation.
Congressman Gosar, I just want to clarify that I think you're misunderstanding how uranium comes to be deposited in breccia pipes. It's deposited where it is because it reaches an area where there is no more oxygen. And so that's the reason that the uranium stays where it is and it becomes a concentrated source of ore. It's when you re-crack open that space, re-expose it to oxygen and water, that you invite the uranium to introduce itself into the environment.
I think the ranking member is now going to yield back. And with that, I'm going to ask a few questions. Ms. Raimondo, why are there so many abandoned uranium mines? And would the reforming of the mining law of 1872 help with some of the problems that, that we see?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are a lot of abandoned uranium mines on the Colorado Plateau for several reasons, but some of the older mines are there because the United States government incentivized the development of those mines with little or no promise to clean them up. And so when the money dried up, the mining companies left and left the taxpayers with the mess.
What about now if we reform the Mining Act of 1872? Would that deal with some of these abandoned mines?
It certainly could help. For one, the introduction of a leasing system like we have for oil, gas, and coal would allow for federal royalties to be charged on hard rock minerals, which they're not currently, and that could be used to help create an additional fund to help pad some of the cost of cleanup. I think another good point about the 1872 mining reform is that unlike now, where the 1872 mining law has created a system where by default all public lands are open to hard rock mining, it would allow for the public to have a say in where is most appropriate for that sort of mining to take place.
Thank you. I'd like to now call Ms. Squassoni. Would increasing domestic uranium mining enhance national security? I know you've touched on that. And is it necessary for nuclear deterrence?
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal. It's completely unnecessary for nuclear deterrence. I believe we have more than enough weapons in our stockpile, and despite the Trump administration's talk of great power competition, we are, for the moment, still confined by the levels under the New START treaty. We have had a policy since 1992 of not producing fissile material for nuclear weapons. Because other of the nuclear weapon states have also done that, except for China, that is the 5 under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So if we're not making new weapons and we have all this material in the stockpile already, I don't think that any envisioned increases, which are not envisioned right now, would require uranium mining. What was the first part of your question? I'm sorry.
That was national nuclear deterrence. Would it enhance increasing domestic uranium mining, enhance national security, was the first part.
Well, again, it depends on how broadly you are defining national security. You can look at dependence on foreign sources as undermining national security. I think I made a point in both my statements that I do not believe that is the case because we procure supply from many different states. We can reduce vulnerability through diversification of supply. And that's just nuclear energy. These other defense purposes that you might use, and I'm not talking uranium, I'm talking enriched uranium, so you have other steps you have to go through. We don't need any more uranium for that. We have more than enough.
Another question. Is an important mineral the same as a critical mineral, and how would you tell the difference?
I think the executive order 13817 defines, for the purposes of this policy, a critical mineral. And in my analysis, uranium does not fit for the reasons that I described before. Again, I think it's certainly strategic. I would like to make one other point, however. Whether or not uranium is on the critical minerals list has no bearing on the ability to support its domestic production. You can do that with other policy vehicles if that is what you would like to do. Taking it off the critical minerals list doesn't really have an impact. I would say, however, that if it is on, there are cascading implications, and I didn't address them in my oral statement, but I do address them in my written statement. There are policies regarding reprocessing and recycling that affect the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle, which I believe would be very negative for U.S. national security.
Well, I think we're just kind of coming to the conclusion of our panel. I'd like to thank the panel. I would like to mention that some of the members may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we're going to ask the panel to respond to those in questions in writing under Committee Rule 3.0. Members of the committee must submit these witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days following.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I've got some, Congressman Cheney could not be here. She would like her statement for the record.
So ordered.
I also have the Uranium Producers of America put together a 2-page document in regards to discussing the numerous flaws in 3405. It does not weaken environmental health or safety protections in the regulatory and permitting processes. Ask for that to be in the record.
So ordered.
Just this week, the Lake Havasu News editorial board in my district published a piece, and I will quote, "Most of the million acres is nowhere near the Grand Canyon, even within the national park. Through naturally occurring uranium deposits mean the mineral is constantly leaching into the Colorado River tributaries with no historic ill effects." We would like to ask that for permission to be put in the record.
So ordered.
Mojave County Supervisors passed a resolution opposing H.R. 1373 and a permanent ban on uranium in Grand Canyon. In the resolution, the Board of Supervisors states, and I quote, "The permanent ban of uranium mining in the Arizona Strip area would be detrimental to our local economy and cause severe economic harm to local communities," end of quote. I ask for that to be placed in the record.
So ordered.
And then the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has entered into enforcement agreements and settlements valued at over $1.7 billion with the Navajo people to clean up abandoned uranium mines that were mined using old mining techniques that were not forced to comply with modern regulations. As a result, funds are available for the cleanup of at least 219 abandoned uranium mines in this area. Mr. Chairman, I ask for permission for this to be entered in the record.
So ordered.
Thank you.
If there's no further business, without objection, this committee stands adjourned.